When you take on responsibility, great powers will come. This is a beautiful quote that was once told to me by a friend. Nah, I'm lying. That's Madame Web's knockoff version of the "with great power comes great responsibility" quote from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies. And you guessed it, yes, that quote was used to motivate Cassandra Webb at the very end of Madame Web. If you couldn't tell already, against my better judgment, I decided to finally watch Madame Web. Now, before I get started on my thoughts regarding Madame Web, I just want to state the following. Throughout my YouTube career, I've always tried to do what I can to make balanced videos about every superhero movie I watch and review. I try my best to always highlight the good, the bad, and the missed opportunities of every movie in the superhero genre to try and create an open dialogue about every superhero movie. That way, my videos can hopefully create a conversation rather than come off as me stating my thoughts or opinions as, "I'm right, you're wrong." With this now being established, Madame Web is horrendous. Madame Web is the worst modern superhero movie ever made. Madame Web is such a bad superhero movie that if you threw every single modern superhero movie into a barrel, Madame Web would be the movie you'd find at the absolute bottom. I had absolute rock bottom expectations before I decided to watch this movie and almost didn't want to believe that all of the scathing reviews could be right, but no, they were right. In a day and age where Warner Brothers can go on to cancel films such as Batgirl for the sake of a tax break, it's absurd that Madame Web somehow made it to the big screen. What makes Madame Web such an incredibly frustrating movie isn't just the poorly written story, terrible pace, annoying product placement, lackluster action sequences, bland soundtrack, the weird decision of having characters avoid saying Peter Parker's name for no real reason, or the poor yet incredibly obvious ADR job done for Madame Web's villain throughout the entire movie. It's Dakota Johnson herself. Make no mistake, everyone involved with Madame Web phoned it in. However, Dakota Johnson took phoning it in to another level. Dakota Johnson plays the unmemorable, uninteresting, and very boring superhero character Cassandra Webb, who as we know is Madame Web. Beyond the aforementioned flaws, the core problem with Cassie Webb is that Dakota Johnson constantly feels like she's out of place in every scene of Madame Web. And trust me, I'm fully aware that there's one tiny argument that can be made to explain this character trait. I know someone out there can say, well, what do you expect? She plays a character that's constantly trying to process the fact that she's suddenly seeing into the future after temporarily dying. How would you react if you were in that position? And you know what? No. That argument isn't good enough, and here's why. There's never a moment where Dakota Johnson reacts to absolutely anything going on in this movie like a normal superhero character. There's never a moment where Dakota Johnson uses any sort of emotional acting range to showcase Cassie Webb's character development throughout Madame Web. There's never a moment where Dakota Johnson has any on-screen chemistry with any of her supporting cast members to the point where every scene she shares with anyone in the Madame Web cast is incredibly hard to watch. If Dakota Johnson showcased that she at least somewhat cared at all whatsoever throughout Madame Web, that tiny amount of effort would have made a huge difference in this movie. And while I do blame Dakota Johnson for making Cassie Webb such an unlikable character, the writers of Madame Web deserve an equal amount of blame too. Cassie Webb and her arc is so poorly written and so poorly thought out that even Halle Berry's Catwoman, who isn't the Catwoman we know and love at all, has more of a character arc than Cassie Webb in Madame Web. Say what you want, but when even some of the worst superhero movies ever made have protagonists that are either likable or memorable due to actors at least trying their best regardless of the circumstances they went through behind the scenes, it makes it hard to overlook how bad of a character Cassie Webb is in this movie. As strange as it might sound, Cassie Webb has no personality at all. She has none of the qualities that are required for her to be a superhero, let alone come off as a superhero. She never uses her powers in a way that makes you excited to see what sort of leap she might take towards the end of Madame Web that'll allow her to save the day. She does absolutely nothing to deserve Uncle Ben, who is the only person in her life who tries to be a friend, considering she treats him terribly. And truthfully, there's nothing memorable about Cassie Webb. In a day and age where we're getting a plethora of superhero content, I'm pretty sure you can ask almost any DC or MCU fan a question about nearly any hero or villain, and they'll be able to say something about them. Tony Stark, genius billionaire playboy philanthropist. Hulk, he's always angry, that's his secret. Kamala Khan, she's obsessed with Captain Marvel and the Avengers. The Guardians of the Galaxy, a bunch of lovable misfits that happen to work well together. Batman tends to work solo, get things done at night, and is always held accountable by his butler, Alfred Pennyworth. Wonder Woman, who could forget that iconic guitar riff? Joker, everyone, and I mean everyone, can name a multitude of fantastic Joker iterations, whether it's from movies, shows, or video games. I say all of this to say that even the most casual moviegoers have references about almost any comic book character because they've seen iterations of them on the big screen that went out of their way to make these characters memorable. Madame Web, on the other hand, failed to do that. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, memorable about Cassie Webb in this movie beyond the simple fact that she still hates her mother, who died because she went into the Amazons to research spiders. Didn't think I managed to fit that reference into the script, did ya? No, but seriously though, you'd think that Cassie would inevitably grow up, heal from this trauma, and stop holding a toxic grudge against her mother, considering she has all the evidence in the world to understand that her mother was someone who did things in the name of science. At least I'd like to think so. I'm kind of making an assumption there, given that we only spend the first 5 minutes of Madame Web with Cassie's mom, and let me tell you, the first 5 minutes of this movie were rough. The first 5 minutes of Madame Web truly wanted you to understand that this movie was about spiders, that Cassie's mom researched spiders, and that the spiders held some sort of special superpowers, which is why she was researching those spiders to begin with. Regardless of the first 5 minutes being extremely rough to get through though, with all of the books Cassie was left with, you'd think she'd get the hint that her mother went into the Amazons for a legitimately understandable reason, but no, she doesn't ever come to that conclusion. Cassie legitimately fails to put any sort of context clues together, whether it's about her mom, her newly granted superpowers, Ezekiel Sims, or the Spider-Woman, who do absolutely nothing and serve absolutely zero purpose in this movie. Cassie puts in absolutely zero effort to put context clues together that allow her to understand what's even going on in Madame Web. This, again, is because of Dakota Johnson's lack of effort and because the writers of this movie did a terrible job at turning this down on your luck and incredibly awkward character who's angry at the world into an unexpected superhero who now has to cope with the fact that she can see into the future. A character like that needs a crystal clear moment that makes her choose to want to be a hero and want to save the world. A character like that needs a crystal clear moment where you see that natural change in her. A character like that needs that moment when you can see her growing into the hero we want her to be. Frustratingly though, there's no growth, development, notable character traits, or even a fun superhero suit-up scene that makes you want to feel remotely anything beyond anger or annoyance towards Cassie Webb. In this day and age, you simply can't afford to release a superhero movie that doesn't at the very least have one of the following: a likable protagonist, which, as I've established, Madame Web completely lacks, a memorable supporting cast of characters, or a truly unforgettable villain. Now, you might be wondering, what could possibly be so wrong with the supporting cast of characters in Madame Web? Well, good question. How can I put this lightly? Madame Web's supporting cast of characters might be the most forgettable and useless characters I've ever seen in a superhero movie. You have Anya, the Hispanic girl who tries to be the voice of reason for her and her friends. You have Maddie, the spunky girl who chooses to keep a distance between her and Cassie Webb. And finally, you have Sydney Sweeney's character Julia, the seemingly awkward girl that tries her best to fit in. That's all you need to know about them. I promise you, these Spider-Woman characters, whose names I had to look up for the sake of this script, do absolutely nothing in this movie besides being dragged from one location to another by Cassie. It's just Cassie and these three girls running away from Ezekiel Sims for the entirety of the movie. They don't play a pivotal role in any moment. They don't have any memorable catchphrases or backstories. They don't get inspired to try and be heroes thanks to Cassie. And honestly, it's hard to even remember why they're even in the movie to begin with. It's not until you get a random scene with Ezekiel staring at a computer monitor with blurry pictures of these girls out of nowhere that you remember that these Spider-Women serve some sort of purpose in this movie. What's sad is that if you try hard to truly attempt to figure out what this movie was originally planning to do with these Spider-Girls, you could see that these girls were going to be so incredibly likable and bring far more to the table. You could tell that originally Madame Web was likely going to be a far more action-oriented superhero Spider-Woman ensemble movie that was focused on the multiverse, timelines, and of course the concept of fate. Sure, it's fair if anybody would want to say, well, that iteration of the movie could have still sucked or have been equally as bad as this Madame Web movie. You might be right. However, that still would have been better than this awful final product of a movie. We didn't need yet another origin story movie for more Spider-Man related characters that the casual audience doesn't know or care about. If you're going to make a movie about Spider-Man related characters that the casual audience knows absolutely nothing about, skipping to a modern timeline where the characters are already active superheroes is a perfectly fine decision. No one could blame any studio for wanting to do that instead of trying to figure out how to make another Spider-Man related origin story movie that tells the same moral lesson everyone knows already. Jumping to a point in time where any Spider-Man related character that the casual audience doesn't know anything about is already active would feel legitimately fresh today and might save the Sony Pictures Spider-Man universe. The casual audience has already seen enough Spider-Man related movies to know the overarching moral lesson that'll be taught by the end of these movies. People know how these movies go. We've already hit the point where the casual audience doesn't need to be reminded that with great power comes great responsibility years ago. At this point, it's almost insulting to still be making Spider-Man related origin story movies or superhero origin story movies unless that movie is going to truly try to do something different than what we've seen before. In the case of Madame Web, this movie is the prime example of why studios need to avoid trying to continuously tell Spider-Man related origin stories where the moral lesson of the movie or show is, with great powers comes great responsibility going forward. If Madame Web didn't do that, and was a story about an active ensemble Spider-Woman superhero team led by Madame Web trying to take down a villain who's very clearly trying to mess with his fate, that would have been so much better and so much more intriguing. Madame Web didn't need to be another bland, butchered, and poorly thought out superhero origin story movie. Madame Web could have simply taken place in the future with the Spider-Women being active superheroes and Madame Web being their leader, as she had already been using her powers along with her, also having the costume she wore at the end of this awful movie. Whether they were super experienced or not doesn't necessarily matter. The point is that we could have skipped their uninteresting origin stories and seen them being heroes, having fun, bouncing off each other, and thinking they're amazing, only for them to realize that they still have a lot to learn. To make things even more interesting, this movie could have had a smaller villain for the Spider-Woman and Madam Web to deal with in the first half of Madam Web, so the Spider-Woman could become resilient superheroes and experienced superhero team, and so they could learn more fighting skills before having to deal with Ezekiel, who also should have been a far better villain than he was in this movie. Just like Madam Web, the movie, if you were to toss all of the comic book villains we know, love, and hate into one massive barrel, at the very bottom, you'd find Ezekiel Sims. Ezekiel Sims is the worst live-action comic book villain ever brought onto the big screen, and it truly isn't close. You can feel whatever way about any DCEU villain, MCU villain, or any of the villains from the Sony Pictures Spider-Man movies. Ezekiel is the absolute worst. He's unremarkable in every possible aspect, as we get to learn absolutely nothing about this man. All we know is that he was with Cassie's mom in the Amazons researching spiders, and he decided to kill her because the spiders grant healing capabilities and other superpowers. That's it. We later find out through Ezekiel that he's gonna die in the future, and the three Spider-Women who aren't Spider-Woman in this movie are the ones that will kill him. Though we never see that happen, as we're only shown glimpses of them fighting Ezekiel. Outside of that, there is absolutely nothing of any importance to remember about Ezekiel. As far as we know, this man has no strategy beyond just stalking monitors all day in hopes of catching girls. No moral compass, as he's never fleshed out. No cool fighting abilities despite having superpowers, and more importantly, it's never even explained as to how he got his super suit. Does his superpowers just give him a suit that kind of just comes on when he wants, kind of like Moon Knight's? Does he have a cool closet where his suit is just sitting there until he needs it? How long does his suit take to put on? None of this is explained. Why isn't this explained? You want us to just accept the fact that he just kind of has one that's the reverse colors of Las Arañas. We'll get to Las Arañas in a minute, don't you worry. What truly makes Ezekiel the worst comic book villain ever brought onto the big screen, though, is that everything this character says in this movie is ADR'd, meaning that yes, his entire dialogue is voiceovered as if you're watching a dubbed anime or TV show. And to make matters worse, it was not only incredibly distracting due to how noticeable it is, but the voiceover was horrendous and incredibly low effort. Every line Ezekiel had was read as if he just took a nap and woke up, and each line was said with one take. This character has zero personality, doesn't do anything noteworthy at all, and notably doesn't even feel like a villain if we're being honest. Ezekiel just feels like a paranoid dude who wants us to believe some random theory. It's not like he takes any sort of villainy action. You'd think with his superpowers he'd run across the city and try to hunt the girls down himself. You'd think he'd have some sort of henchmen that are evil versions of Las Arañas, considering he still has one superpower granting spider in his apartment. With him knowing the future, he could have easily spent years building an army, training the evil army, and having that surprise backup plan to shock the Spider-Woman with a surprise gank from his henchmen. Why didn't he do that? He didn't even try. No one, and I mean no one, can convince me that Ezekiel Sims tried that. If you're going to tell me that the only way for Ezekiel to survive is him pulling a reverse flash, you gotta show me all of his failed attempts, or at least multiple failed attempts. You can't just be like, he has to do this, it's his only way to win. That's not convincing enough, nor is it good enough for a superhero movie with today's standards of storytelling. To give some context regarding Las Arañas, literally translated as the spiders, I'll make it as simple as possible. In the world of Madame Web, Las Arañas are magical spider warriors who only live in the Amazon and protect people with their superpowers. When Ezekiel killed Cassie's mom, Las Arañas grabbed Cassie's mom and brought her to a magical pool of water that would later on grant Cassie her ability to look in the future. Trust me, I know that was a confusing sentence, but without Las Arañas grabbing Cassie's mom, we wouldn't have our superhero protagonist Madame Web in this movie. Oh, and by the way, they also wear a terrible looking knockoff version of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man suit. That's all you really need to know, besides that they tried to hunt down Ezekiel when he killed Cassie's mom, but they failed to grab him. That's why he was able to run off with one of the magical spiders in the beginning of the movie. As I was saying though, Ezekiel sucks. All he does is stand around in his massive apartment and watch monitors for 95% of the movie. It's not until the final 15 minutes of the movie that he does something remotely cool, and by cool, I mean he jumps off a building, slowly stands up, and gives us the one cool shot of his ugly looking superhero suit that's never explained. Yes, that's right. The highlight of Ezekiel's shortly lived villain career is him standing still. If that doesn't tell you how awful of a character he is, I don't know what will. You know, I was supposed to end the video here, but I had a conversation with one of my friends about Madame Web, and it made me realize something. Firstly, yes, I spent way too much time thinking about this awful movie, and it did not deserve this amount of effort from me. Secondly though, I might be crazy and I could be wrong, but I would regret not at least bringing up this realization in this video. When I realized this, I knew I had to talk about it, so hold up, let me cook. In this movie, Cassie sees the gigantic S from the Pepsi sign that falls during the final fight of the movie at an earlier point of time in the movie. This, of course, implies that Cassie can see into the future, and what she sees are fixed points within the Spider-Verse, or at the very least, time, which might make this theory easier to accept, I guess. This theory is not only proven by the outcome of the final fight, but also during the epilogue of the movie, where she reacts to multiple things the Spider-Woman do or say before those things happen. Does this movie explain Cassie's powers at all? No, not at all, but to me, this train of thought makes sense one way or another. With all this now being established, this would also imply that anyone who has those powers granted from the spiders that Cassie's mom was researching in the Amazons also sees fixed points in the Spider-Verse or time as well. Now, if you're wondering who else has those same powers, this includes Las Arañas, and you guessed it, Ezekiel Sims. Trust me, I know what you're thinking. Why is any of this relevant, and what am I cooking right now? The reason I bring any of this up is because this would then imply that Ezekiel not only didn't die at the end of Madame Web, but he did absolutely nothing after losing this first fight with the Spider-Woman before they even got their powers or superhero suits. So after losing to literal teenage girls and Cassie, who did nothing in that fight if we're being honest, Ezekiel did nothing. He didn't train to try and become stronger. He didn't try to raise a spider army like I mentioned earlier. As far as we know, he did nothing after the ending of Madame Web. He saw his future, made one single plan to try and stop it, saw it fail in real time, and just accepted his fate. Meanwhile, we're talking about a supposed superhero villain. How am I supposed to accept that Ezekiel is a villain when he failed once and decided, you know what? I'm just gonna get old and wait out this long inevitable death that will come one day. This dude doesn't even deserve to be called a villain. He couldn't fully commit the rest of his life to trying to beat fate and prepare for a final fight against the Spider-Woman, and to make matters even worse, assuming I'm completely correct on this stupid theory I probably should have never thought of to begin with, this also means that we, the viewers, know the actual ending of Madame Web's timeline or story, despite it not being the climax or ending of the film. This makes Madame Web an unfinished movie that was a complete waste of everybody's time. Okay, look, I know you didn't need this whole theory or realization of mine to prove that last line, but still, they couldn't even get us to the actual finish line. How do you set up the actual climax of this movie story but end up not even committing to it? What caused such a harsh pivot at the very last minute of this movie's production? What was the point in keeping the half-assed ADR butchered storyline instead of just canning the whole movie? Why didn't her web truly connect all of these characters? There are so many questions about this terrible Madame Web movie, and yet so few answers. As I said at the top of the video, Madame Web is the worst superhero movie ever made. Madame Web does absolutely nothing correct or anything to earn its spot in history as a potential cult classic film. The only way that could have happened is if this movie fully committed to be as bad as the early 2000s superhero movies by putting Linkin Park's What I've Done as the song that plays in the final moments of the movie. I would have legitimately loved that, and it would have felt like even the people involved with this movie knew it was bad, so they did it for the bit. Plus, it would have actually fit the tone of the final moments of the movie. Talk about a missed opportunity. If you ask me, Madame Web isn't going to be a Catwoman, Daredevil, Batman and Robin or Morbius situation where despite everyone universally accepting how bad those movies are, they still love them for whatever reason years later. Madame Web is awful from top to bottom, and its failure will be remembered for the rest of time without any revisionist history. While it should have never seen the light of day, maybe it did some good by allowing us to look at some of the other superhero movies we dislike and think, you know, maybe it's not so bad after all. Madame Web is a terrible disaster and a complete waste of anyone's time. It's hard to ever want to revisit this movie ever again. It's hard to ever want to talk about this movie ever again. And truthfully, it's hard to feel any sort of sympathy towards this movie as well. The entire movie feels like a step-by-step tutorial on what not to do if you're going to make a superhero movie. From the terrible acting, to the lack of action, to the horrible storytelling, to the ridiculous product placement, to the unmemorable soundtrack, to the useless supporting cast of characters, to the worst comic book villain brought onto the big screen, Madame Web is the definitive worst modern superhero movie ever made, and unfortunately, we still have more Sony Pictures Spider-Man movies to endure because they're gonna keep making them anyways. Maybe the spiders and the Amazons are right. Maybe this failure truly is a fixed point in our timeline after all.